Hi, I'm Diana Sullivan. I'm posting some sample lessons from my beginning machine knitting course. Check out this lesson and then consider getting all 35 lessons either on 2 DVDs or on a USB flash drive. Doing these lessons can really jumpstart your skills and your confidence. Click on the link for this course as well as all my patterns and products. How to make a gauge swatch. Now, typically for Brother machines you need a 40 stitch by 60 row gauge swatch. Some of the other machines require a different size swatch for their charting device, but the important thing to think about here is that your swatch needs to be enough stitches and enough rows so that you get a good measurement. And you're not going to lay a tape down and count individual stitches. You're going to measure between markers and measure a large enough number of stitches so that it's valid for an entire sweater. This helps you get good fit. Now, for starters, this particular swatch has a number of little tricks I learned over the years from other knitters. It has 6 little holes. That indicates to me that this swatch was made on tension 6, and if it was made on tension 6.2, I would have 6 little holes and then a few stitches plain, and then I would have 2 more holes. After that, the swatch has a double line of a contrasting color. These 2 rows of purple divide the measured rows from the rest of the swatch. And please note that even though it's not a great cast on, this is a cast on that will not unravel. I did the cast on, Diana's cast on, just to keep it quick. Now the little dots along each side of the swatch indicate 40 stitches. It is 40 stitches from the inside of that dot to the inside of the dot on the other side. And the reason why there are 5 dots on each side is that gives me 5 separate places to measure. Now this gauge swatch has been lightly blocked so that it's ready to measure. In fact, it's been blocked and laundered. I always block and launder my swatches before I use them. After I've knitted my 60 rows, then I have 2 more rows of the contrasting color to mark the end of 60 rows. In this way, I'm going to be able to measure 60 rows between the purple lines, and I will do that in several places. Finally, I have a number of rows of yarn beyond that. That knitting is just to keep the shape of the swatch, and it is also cast off. I use the loop through a loop bind off up there so that this swatch can go in the washing machine or be laundered whatever way I'm planning to wash the finished garment without coming apart. Now to begin, for a 40 stitch wide swatch, we want to cast on 60 stitches. So I'm going to bring out every other needle from 30 left to 30 right. And of course, with it being every second needle, it works out from 29 left to 30 right. But I'll get the other needle when I hang the comb. I've set the machine on tension 6, and I'm threading the machine. Now, if my garment were going to be with a pattern, I would knit the swatch in the same pattern, whether it's lace or fair isle or double jacquard or whatever my pattern is. The swatch is done the same way as the finished garment. One stitch that didn't pick up. At this point, I'm going to hang a comb and weights. The comb's on, the weights are on. I bring out the in-between needles, and I'm going to do some rows of this yarn. Now, if I were really short on yarn, I could use waste yarn for the top and bottom of the swatch, the areas that won't be measured. However, I'm not short on this yarn, so I will use the actual yarn. After I put on a few rows, I want to put in my markings for the tension. And because I'm on tension 6, I'm picking out 6 needles for my eyelets, and I'm just going to make the eyelets with the transfer tool. I often make the eyelets with the lace carriage. That's just a fast way to do it. Then after the eyelets, I need to knit several more rows before I put in the marker rows. I make sure after the eyelets are done that the needles that I emptied are still in B position, so they'll make an eyelet and not a ladder. When I have plenty of knitting on and I'm ready to do my marker rows, what I like to do is unthread the machine and just set the yarn out of the way. I do not cut the yarn. Then I take the contrasting color, thread the machine and knit 2 rows, and I'll clip the contrasting color because I'm finished with it for now. Now I begin counting my rows. I thread up with my main color. I'm going to knit 60 rows, but every 10 rows I'm going to put my markers 40 stitches apart. So 10 rows. Now to do the markers, what I do is take a long piece of the contrasting yarn and clip it. It's going to make my markers. I'll do it on both sides of the knitting. I begin by bringing out needle 21 right of 0 and needle number 21 left of 0. Those are going to be purple, so the stitches in between is 40. And I take one end of the marker yarn and knit it through on the right, and I'll take the other end of the marker yarn and knit it through on the left. I could use 2 pieces if I had 2 small pieces. So that was 10 rows. And at the 20th row, I repeat that procedure. I'm knitting through a long piece of purple on the right on needle 21 and a long piece of purple on the left on needle 21. Knit 10 more rows. Now this puts me at 30 rows, but I'm going to do this for rows 40 and 50 as well, and then when I get to row 60, row 61 is going to be purple. So I'll come back at that point. Here I am with 60 rows knitted. I'm going to take the scissors and cut this purple yarn because I'm finished with that piece. And these are the markers on the wrong side hanging down. I'm also going to unthread the carriage so that I can use the pink later. I'll just get it out of the carriage and I'll hang it over the edge of the machine over on the far side. Just out of my way. This hanging the yarn for 2 rows keeps me from having more raggedy ends of pink to possibly interfere with laundering and blocking. Now I take my purple yarn and thread with that and do 2 rows. Doesn't matter what you use for your waste yarn as long as the thickness is similar to the main yarn and you have a good, strong contrast in the color, so that you can easily see to do your measuring. And of course you would want it to be a yarn that you can wash in the same way. It would be kind of bad if your marker was some sort of shrinky yarn and it shriveled up and the rest of the sample stayed the same size. So now I'm going to do my rows of additional knitting at the top of the sample before I bind off. Now this whole process presupposes that you have already tried knitting with the yarn in different stitches and different textures and you are satisfied with what you're going to get. With this particular yarn, I am happy with it at tension 6 and a plain stockinette. So what I'm going to do at this point is a quick loop through a loop cast off. I've gone to my loosest tension because I was on tension 6, and to get extra tension I'm pulling the yarn down loose from above, knitting across very slowly, and I'll down more yarn, just keep things loose. Then I can clip the end, and while I'm clipping, I'll look around and clip any of the other pieces that are long and might be a problem for me later. Now I'm ready to bind off. Loop through a loop bind off is in another lesson. I'll just bring all the needles out and use my latch tool to bind off. Now the job isn't done until the sample is processed in the same way that the sweater will be. So this sample has to go through, in this case for a washable sweater, it has to go through the washer and dryer on the settings that I will typically use, and it needs a light steaming. This is acrylic and I'm not going to kill this, I'm just going to steam it gently. Now, this is a little bit of a ritual. You don't have to do your gauge sample exactly this way. But the reason I like to do it this way is that the eyelet holes in there are a permanent way to mark the sample. I don't have to staple on a piece of paper or write anything out. I can have this sample ready to go and standing by, and then if I don't have time to knit the sweater for several months, it doesn't matter. I've got the sample and I'm ready to go, and even if I didn't take enough notes, I can clearly see that this was tension 6. So that's how to knit a gauge sample, and in particular this is the gauge sample that you need if you're going to use a Brother Knit Leader with a standard machine. Now before washing and blocking, the gauge sample is going to be curly, and it's going to curl toward the purl side on each edge, and it'll curl toward the knit side, top and bottom. And typically you give it a little vertical tug just to set the stitches. Let it rest if you have time for a day or two, and then you go ahead and do whatever blocking procedure you plan to do, and there's your gauge sample. Typically do the measurement of your gauge sample in centimeters, and I usually use a tape measure, not an old ratty one, but one that's in good shape and hasn't stretched. And I will measure between the dots. So for instance, this is 13.8 centimeters from exactly that stitch to the right of that dot to the edge of that stitch to the left of that dot. And then this one is 13.7, and this one is 13.7, and this one is 13.8, and this one up here is 13.5. So I would either take the average or take the number that came up the most often. I would count that as 13.7 centimeters for 40 stitches. Now to know how many stitches in a centimeter, you take the 40 and you divide by the 13.7 if you need to know that. I'll measure the 60 rows in several places. I get 14.5 centimeters, 14.6 centimeters, 14.5, 14.5. So 14.5 is the answer for the length of 60 rows. So there's how to make your gauge swatch. If you like the sample lesson, consider getting the whole course, which is available at www.dianaknits.com. And did you know I have hundreds of machine knitting videos on YouTube? Check out my channel, Diana Knits, and subscribe. I also have a blog and a Facebook group. These are all free resources to help you on your machine knitting journey.